Cocktail parties at 6 and then dinner at 7. You got someone? I can't hear you.
My topic is the 21st century newsroom. It is a, I don't know if case study is the right way because it's still going on. But at this point in time, after about a 2-year venture with a rather large news organization, up-and-coming news organization called Al Jazeera, we are in the final processes, our company, Diversified Systems, of finishing the implementation for the new facilities in Washington, D.C. So that's basically what this is going to talk about. So the challenges that we faced in doing this were sort of outlined as follows. First, we were building upon an existing newsroom operations is certainly one thing to do. Building up a news organization from scratch is another. But building up a global news entity and transforming it into a universal operational model is an altogether different task. And to throw more at it, especially when you're dealing with multiple languages, different cultures, and 3 different continents all at the same time. So a little bit about Al Jazeera in general, since not too many people really know the history around it. It was founded around 1996. The date varies a couple of years either way. Headquartered in Doha, Qatar. In Arabic, the word Al Jazeera actually means island, referring to the Arabian Peninsula in which the country sits upon. You might have wondered what the icon that you see in the means. It's to signify a golden drop of water. And it's said to spell Al Jazeera in Arabic, and believe me, I didn't bother to try and learn a bit of Arabic in this. In January 1999, these are some of the high points. The news outlet had tripled its force to over 500 employees, adding bureaus in Europe and Russia in particular. 2003, there were 23 bureaus, 1,300 employees. November 2006, the Al Jazeera English channel was launched, and in 2011 the Qatari government actually relinquished its control and turned it over to the private entities, and in 2013 you may have remembered Al Gore's Current TV network was launched, and that sort of rounded out the news over the web and so forth, over the top sort of activities. These are the primary areas where they have activities or they have bureaus in major points. The first one that we were involved in was in New York City. We put the Manhattan Center together shortly before NAB 2 years ago. It was an operating facility for other purposes that we repurposed and added switchers and robotic cameras and all sorts of things like that, put a huge Avid system into it. Our process actually is about 2 years in the works right now. There was an RFP that was issued. We responded to it among another number of other vendors. All told, we had about 6,000 lines of Excel content material, some of them multiple quantities and lines. Once it was awarded, we learned more about the facility than was ever in the RFP or in the expectations. First of all, there was a project in London, which was about a month ahead of us by another vendor. And the Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, Qatar, was underway for its plan and is actually coming online very shortly now. We began the Washington, D.C. project about October of 2014, and we moved people in there in March of this year. And we're still on site finishing up things like quality assurance tests and performance, things like that. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Doha. My experience was we immediately, within 2 weeks of being awarded the job, we ended up going to Doha. We took 11 of us on one airplane, and it was quite a marvelous 14-hour experience. It was direct out of JFK. And when we landed there, we got into an automobile, and those of us that could see the dashboard of it actually saw that the temperature outside was indeed 127 degrees Fahrenheit. I kid you not. Again, in North America operations, they have the Manhattan Center, which is the news studios for the Al Jazeera America channel. It broadcasts via Encompass services out of Stamford, Connecticut. The West Coast is the former Current TV operations. It's now aljazeera.net, where they do the web and OTT productions. And in Washington, D.C., Al Jazeera International was put together in 2006, rather. Initially, it houses the Arabic and the English channels and its international bureaus. And as I said, we moved it to the New Hampshire location in this year. The project scope consisted of building out a facility basically in Washington, D.C. That's about what we knew, other than the parts and pieces that were going to go into it and the time frame for it. What we did find out later on was that we would be following a workflow plan that was designed for the London operation, which was to be the first to come online of the new AJWT systems themselves. We had to adapt the London formats to North American formats, obviously. We had to retain consistent interchange among all the locations. We ultimately designed, installed, deployed, migrated, and documented all functions and workflows for the new site, as did the other vendors for the other countries. Then we moved the existing facility about 7 to 8 blocks away, and we are charged with supporting the facility for a full year after acceptance. Washington, D.C. beforehand was a news bureau only, had no transmission services at all. All the content that was created was sent basically up to New York or across the pond to Doha, where it was integrated into their global services. Again, there were 2 languages, 2 different bureau systems there, one in Arabic and one in English. And the secondary location, which they built a few years later in the museum, which is in downtown Washington, D.C. And that was the first time they were using the Avid system. Previous to that, in fact, up until the time they moved out, they were using the Grass Valley News Browse system as this newsroom computer system, K2 storage. I actually, not sure if it was actually K2 storage, but basically a GXF wrapped or SMT360, if I remember the number right, a variety of mixed codecs, and it consisted from an asset management or media management standpoint of a SpectraLogic LTO2 tape system and a front porch Diva archive, of which there were no updates to that. They made no improvements, no software upgrades, no changes in tape format at all since the 2007 installation was on. This kind of gives you an idea of how far we moved it. The AJ International is where it is on K Street, and then the Star up in the on the left-hand side there is its current location at 1200 New Hampshire Northwest. Sort of outside look at the building. If any of you know Washington, D.C. at all, it's in the same building as the Grillfish restaurant. Yeah, it's actually right down the block from CBS and the European Broadcasting Union on M Street. It's at the corner of M Street in New Hampshire. In the new design, we were charged with building the major operational areas, which consisted of an MCR. Now, their word for MCR is different from what our MCR is. It's really their TOC center, and it supports all of the media management. They built the studio production control room designs. The newsroom consisted mainly of Avid iNews, a production asset management system, the Interplay. Studio playout, a dual set of ISIS storages. There were a pair of 7 crate ISIS storages. And again, our tasks were to establish and refine the workflows to match London. In doing that, we selected a vendor that has been working with them for about 2.5, 3 years before that to develop a global workflow from a company called Arvados/S4M or Solutions for Media. And it included both card-based ingest as well as VTR, file-based ingest, satellite, the whole plethora that you deal with in any news organization. Centralized storage is on an Isilon 5-node platform, and there are 2 codec formats, which I'll get into a little bit later, and we built out a 3-cabinet designed for 5-cabinet Diva archive system. Again, 2 different sets of formats inside of that in terms of the Arabic and the English, and then 2 languages. Some of the pictures we collected along the way. These are the production control rooms for studios A and B that are on the first floor. Some pictures of in progress and some finished pictures, and a working newsroom, which is also on the first floor. The second floor, there's a central apparatus room, or a CAR, is their version of the terminal equipment room, terminal gear room, depending upon which company you work for, the different names for it. ENG is housed there. The master control room, working newsrooms, several of the editing bays, as well as craft editing. There's a production control room on that floor and a news studio, and that'll kind of give you an idea of what they look like. On the roof, we put that steel platform there, mounted 5 fixed antennas. There are an equal number of 3.4 meter and 2.1 meters. There's a one agile antenna, 3.7 meter, the one on the far, far left closest to the crane. By the way, the crane is in a very narrow spot. It's building an addition onto the hotel, and there were times when when we would show up to work and an entire window had been taken out of the rooms that we were working on, and we wondered whether the crane had hit it or whether it had been moved or whether they were just trying to get things done on the construction site. But it's a very unusual place to work when it was, if you remember the winter of last year, sub 10 degree temperatures a lot of times. So we literally had to wear coats inside the working office area. Not to mention the fact we put this together on the roof when it was very cold. So there's the GPS antennas up there, or on the other side of the penthouse is the generator and the cooling towers. The formats and goals for the system were identified pretty early. When we first put the proposal in, we were only concerned with doing XDCAM 50 for all of the content. Once it was awarded, of course, a lot of plans were going on from their global standpoint, and they changed the rules on us and said, we're going to use XDCAM 50 for all the news-oriented content, and we're going to change to AVC-intra class 100, which is 100 megabit 422 coding for all program content. And we thought this at first meant that things that they would record in the studio would be cached into that particular codec, the AVC-100. And that anything else that would be for news and play out would be XDCAM 50. We have since found that, and we expected that mixture to be somewhere around 30-70%, 70% being the XDCAM, 30% being the AVC-intra. As we've put the system together, we found that to be quite the opposite, and we're now dealing with a lot of file management changes in order to deal with that. We also had to manage both 50 hertz product and 5994 hertz content. So anything that came over from London or from any parts of the Euro areas at all, we had to immediately do one of two things. If it was a linear content and recording, we had to transcode it, or actually had to transrate it for scanning purposes. If it was a file-based, we used a Telestream Vantage system, quite a large Vantage system to make those changes. So everything was eventually, once it got past the boundaries into the system, became 5994, 1920, 1080. We have built out automated ingest and file management systems. I'll show you some diagrams and what those look like in the future. We did establish that 5994 would be the house format. We wouldn't have to manage editing on other different platforms until the investigative group came in and says, no, we're going to be doing mostly work for London, so we want everything to be in 50 hertz. That lasted about 3 weeks, and the complications in dealing with it forced it right back to 5994. There's no SD in the plant. Anything that was SD legacy has been up or cross-converted, so everything is stored in HD. Because it is a mixed environment, meaning that the Avid platform uses OP Atom as the MXF wrapper, and the rest of the world in the facility uses MXF OP1A, there is quite a bit of what I'll call trans-wrapping as opposed to transcoding, and I'll go through some of the steps that we went through to make that happen. And then there's, of course, a master transcode, an Interabate QC farm, the central storage, all of the ingest, all the send to archive, all the send to Avid, all the proxies and so forth are all automated and under control of the media asset management system. So again, the workflow include card-based media. There's minimal baseband SDI. About the only thing that's SDI would be a satellite feed that they couldn't get any other way except by linear, and those get recorded into sets of Avid airspeeds in pools. Again, the transcoding processes happen in two different areas. There's a product from a vendor called MOG Technologies that we use for ingest processing. It's a higher speed file-based ingest system. It originally was just going to be used for trans-wrapping to move from content that came in as MXF, OP1 Atom, or as OP1A, either one of them, switching them back and forth depending upon whether they're being archived or whether they were being used in Avid for editing. Again, the trans-wrapping processes, and those are the particular MXF standards from SMPTE. MAM controls all of the pre- and post-production file migration. So if a file is brought into the system at all, the MAM grabs it, registers it, checks it, processes it, okays it, approves it, and it moves on into whatever it's happened, whatever function it happens to need. Inside, from the human standpoint, there's the media management, or they call it the media hub, which is located in the newsroom. It's staffed by 5 people, almost all full-time. These are the people that handle all the media routing and all the management functions. They handle all the conflict resolution for feeds and editing. If something didn't pass right, they have to deal with it. So they are pretty knowledgeable in all of the different systems, which typically are automated but can be manually overwritten. They prepare the files as they're going outbound or for inbound for other activities, including web services. Although there's no web broadcasting and there's no send to CDNs in this facility, that's all sent overseas and done in Doha, where it's accumulated and then distributed from websites in Doha. But there are systems that send via Signet and Aspera to New York and to London, and it also, the media management hub decides what gets archived and what gets restored from the archive. Central editorial and storage interfaces include the Avid ISIS. Again, I said there were 14 crates. It's quite a large Avid system. Avid being wrapped in OP Atom, and then the Isilon, everything that's on the Isilon central storage and in the archive is OP1 Atom, OP1A wrapped. And believe me, you say that enough, you get it wrong every once in a while. The tape format for the archive, by the way, is the IBM Jaguar format. It holds about 4 terabytes raw, uncompressed data on each tape. That was a universal standard that they moved to. That meant that everything that we had done in the Manhattan Center in New York, which is on LTO 5 and 6, is now going to have to shift again to the IBM format when that moves. And the MOG technologies, again, these are the products that are 1 rack unit servers that do transwrapping and transcoding, because when we figured out the workflows, we actually had individual sets of boxes, 3 of each flavor, making a total of 9 that were dedicated to functions. By the time we started actually building up the workflows and testing things and looking at the volume of files that would be going through the system, we decided to reconfigure everything. We put XDCAM and AVC-intra transcoders into each one of them, and then put them into a pool, which is then managed entirely by the asset management system. About 95% of the content in the facility are files only. They ingest in anything from P2 to S/S to XDCAM to HDV, you name a format, because it's a news and stringer organization, they have to handle it. The feeds that come into IP are typically Reuters, NBC, and ABC, the news services, and so forth. And all told, there are 32 inbound and 32 outbound fiber services that connect Washington and the rest of the world. Still a little bit of SD routing, actually quite a bit. There's over 500 squared router that's still doing the normal live things. There's almost 0 linear tape. We purchased 2 tape machines and they brought over 4, and that's all there are in the whole facility. In addition to the IP transport of signals around, there are 120 channels of internal television from Xterity that do the video encoding, the delivery, and there's desktop video to every single user in the facility. From a statistics standpoint, these are the servers and storage counts. In graphics alone, and that's primarily it's the VizRT platform, there's 51 various servers that feed that, and 2 RAID stores for database purposes. Avid consists of 71 servers, and they're AS3000 series servers, 14 ISIS crates, and 1 database cluster, which is redundant. There's a transcoding farm and the MAM and all the converters that go with that, a total of 61 servers, and these are nameplate Dell HP 1 and 2 rack unit typical servers that you find in facilities like this. There are a number of other workstations, 23 of them that I counted the last time I went through the facility. And then for the enterprise activities, which we also build out their email services and their corporate services, there's another 37 servers. All of these servers, every single one, is connected to a 270 by 100 kVM matrix. So I'll show you, I'm sorry? I knew you'd ask that. Avocent. Yeah. Well, is it KVM over IP? No, it's not. It's not for speed purposes. So. Believe me, there's probably 30 engineers in our company that worked on this, and we had to divide up tasks all different places. And I apologize for not knowing every number of products that are in the system. I'll give you a little bit on the background in this. This is the network view, I guess. You can plainly see that there are two sections, of an A and a B section. This is the core background, the ASA firewalls that come in, the intrusion protection systems. You can see they're virtually tied and cross-tied back and forth across each other. I think you can probably read I can't from here, but the bandwidths of the data systems at that point, and then they come down to the core Nexus 7010 systems, and we really wanted to build this with something with more horsepower than 7010s, the next stage up, but we were overridden pretty quickly. This is the Avid system itself. In the bottom here, again, the kind of left and right cross-tied together that you can see. The aggregation switches are here. The distribution systems out to the workstations are here. And those distribution systems were not only in the core car area, but also in all the MDFs and IDFs throughout the building. And this is the services side of it. You can kind of get the idea that these are the services that are pooled together. They're allocated throughout the whole facility. And then these are all of the operational or broadcast systems and things of that nature. And this is the broadcast LAN. This is equipment like iControl, the switcher interfaces and things like that. And by the time you get all done with it, that's, without the details of what they're connected to, that's what the entire layout looks like. Whoops, let's see. Total summary, you can kind of read the numbers there. 222 commercial off-the-shelf server type products. Again, primarily HP and Dell. 23 workstation class PCs. Those are primarily HP Z840s or 820s and 420 series. We got those in just under the gun before HP changed all the models again. 14 ISIS chassis. There's over 50 Cisco switches in here. There are 7 SQL or clustered database systems. A petabyte of media is actively available at all times, including the database storage. And there's a 400 slot archive capable of 1.84 petabytes raw storage. This is, of course, an eye chart, but this is one of the diagrams that we had to ultimately create. I did this while I was in Doha on a long-distance telephone call with VizRT because we didn't have any of the information. We just had an equipment list. We had to figure out what all these parts and pieces were in the equipment list and how they were going to be allocated during our workshops there. And I'll show you the details of this a little bit later. You can see these are the post-production sections of the graphics. This is the news sections up here. These are all the core systems and their redundancies. And then these are the more of the core systems and their backup sections over here. The graphics and systems were basically editorial driven. Everything that goes into a graphics component is sent through an Avid or an iNews environment. We have a total of 3 Apple Mac towers for doing conventional graphics and a number of VizRT integrations, the 51 servers and workstations throughout it. The live graphics are consisted of, per production control room, there are 3 channel engines, and I'll show you that in a second. There's an Avid command and an iNews-driven centric force for getting the graphics onto the actual air during live production. The studios are driven to VizRT engines and an ORAD monitor wall system, so all of the graphics that you see in the studio pictures are all VizRT-driven through a routing switch or straight out of a production mix effects bank into an ORAD system which has its own router and then sent back to the monitors respectively, so they can multi-purpose use the studios. And the studios consisted of in the floor as well as in the wall graphics. The core systems are built out of, as I showed in the diagram, redundant core servers and databases, and there's a shared system, basically 3N plus 1 M as a media sequencer that can be turned up if one of the media sequencers in one of the studio production systems goes down. From the graphics standpoint, and this is typical of each of the studios, this is the control room operator's positions here. There's a DVI preview of the graphics. These are the software components, the options and so forth that you get that are loaded onto the workstations, or the engines actually. And then there are 3 channels that go out here. One of the channels is used for lower thirds, one of them for full screen graphics, and the other one feeds the ORAD system. And you can kind of see the kinds of graphics that they generate. Studio productions. Every studio is equipped with robotic cameras, pedestals, and jibs. There is extensive use of Viz products for social media. The graphics are integrated, as I said, into the floors and the walls. You can kind of see the floors, the walls, the backgrounds, and so forth. There's a mixture of LED and quartz lighting. That was a different contractor. We didn't have anything to do with that. So I can't tell you what kind of lighting was really in there other than the types. Again, a little bit about the studio walls during construction in August of last year and here. Control rooms, there's 3 of those, and then this is the master control. It's just a ring of monitors, all from the iControl platform. This is where 3 of the 5 managers sit, and 2 more of them sit back here, plus a supervisor. Real quick view of audio. I wasn't able to capture a picture of the actual control rooms, but it gives you an idea of, it's a very small space. There is a small backup mixer off to the side. Post-production audio is the typical Design type system that you'd find from Avid. Media asset management, as I mentioned, was done by a product. Its name is VPMS. It is used globally. All of the databases will eventually be tied together. There are specific workflows that were universally and globally deployed at all locations, so that a person working in London could come over to work in the Al Jazeera English channel in Washington, D.C. and not seem like they had changed anything other than the location. The VPS MEM manages everything, ingest, transcode, transfer, and so forth, but there are components such as the ingest portion of Avid, which we replicated. In other words, VPMS runs, but the Avid equivalent of it runs in parallel with it, so that if the VPMS choked or something happened that caused the production of files through the system to quit, then they could immediately switch over to Avid, and there's 5 or 6 areas that work like that. For example, you could take the entire transcode farm and run it manually if you wanted to. I wouldn't bless that on anybody, but it could happen. There is the Interplay Production Asset Management, which is dedicated just for editing for iNews. It consists of Media Composer and the ISIS storage. And again, I keep coming back on this differing wrappers thing. It is an interesting challenge that we have dealt with, particularly with how files have to migrate through a plant of this complexity. This is another diagram, basically the whole overall workflow of the system. This is the typical ingest consisting of physical media and IRDs and so forth. Card-based media happens here. It's pushed through the system. This is the traffic cop, the manager. Every one of these little excuse me, every one of the boxes that rim this are a service that's provided to some other part of the system, and you can see how extensive the Avid system is. So it actually operates in isolation from this, and it just takes and hands files off to here, or this system hands them back to here. All of these down below are the media systems, the transcode functions, QC, archive, and so forth. But it kind of gives you an idea. It's a one-shot look at what we had to do to design the whole system and convey the design to the end user for training purposes. Pictures of the facility themselves. There's the car. You can see one row of racks here. The system here is all of the inbound internet and so forth, from firewalls working their way all the way down through the switches and so forth, for both enterprise and for broadcast. At one point, these then branch out, as you saw in the diagram, to the various services that are scattered throughout the racks. we would have liked to have done for future proofing a top of rack, end of row switch configuration, but it turned out it wasn't an economical approach at all. So most of the aggregation switches and distribution switches are in a facing rack on the other side, so the cables go up over the top and back and forth like this. This is a layout of the equipment room itself. This is primarily the broadcast portions of it, and the rest of this is all IT based. One of the things that the people at Al Jazeera wanted is a centralized monitoring system, and when I say centralized, it truly is that. They can look at a power strip in a rack in Doha by a monitoring system that they specified. Every one of the racks have dual power supplies. If there is a device that only has a single power supply, we put in a $1,200 AB switch, so you plug in one cord in the back and two come out the back, just so that they could be failed over for one or the other. And some of the vendors that provided the servers to us picked the lowest end servers they could possibly do with fixed hardwired power supplies and won. So you bought a server for $2,000, and then we put a $1,200 switch on the outside of it to protect it for power. Foolishness, but you know. Excuse me, I went too far. UPS is a 600 kVA system. The generator on the roof is a 1.5 megawatt. The entire system is monitored from a broadcast standpoint by the Grass Valley Eye Control. Of course, when we started at it, it was the Miranda Eye Control. So it meant all of our documentation got to change midway through this. And the Skyline data miner system is the SNMP monitor. It looks at all the power. It looks at all of the eye control and signals statuses both locally and remotely. So in any project like this, kind of sailed through the design and the construction part of it, but here's where the real issues come out. Any project of this scale and this size has a set of issues. Most of them take more time than you ever expected to deal with, that you ever budgeted to deal with, and requires knowledge bases that you've probably never dealt with before. But this project was no different. All three of these happened on a regular basis, and in some cases they're still happening today as we're proving workflow changes. I'm going to give you examples of three of the system, or three of the situations or issues that we dealt with as went on. About halfway through the build, when things were actually up and many of the vendors had already commissioned the system, we got orders from Doha to change the entire change the entire clock systems from local time to UTC, Universal Coordinated Time, and to set everything to GMT-0. And they thought we could just do this in one day. Well, as I said, all the systems were tested, everything was running. In fact, some of the vendors had already left. They'd done their job. So at this point, it was currently set to GMT +5. We weren't in daylight saving times, thank goodness, at that time. And again, they wanted this overnight. There were no expectations on anybody's side of what would happen with the interoperability issues or systems impact. So rather than just saying, we'll just shut it down and change it over and see what happens, no, we went back to every vendor and we said, so what happens if we change the database and you fire yourself back up and look at something else that you were dependent upon? Are you going to revert your database back to the old one, or we're going to wind up in this circle? It turned out some of the products were that way. Some of the other some of the vendors actually had to write some patch codes around it so that we could tell them to manually now sync the database. Every one of these things were mapped out in a Gantt chart on an hourly basis. Literally everything we would start to do. We shut the systems down starting about midnight on Friday. And we did it as though it was really an active system. They weren't working in the facility. They were testing, but not working there, thank goodness. And then we ran it through, and surprisingly, everything kind of worked the way we thought it would. But had we not done that, we think we'd probably been in a disaster. So that's just one little issue we went through. Another one that we started in August of last year was the legacy archive migration planning. There are the two different archives that were in the existing facility in K Street had to be moved, but we didn't know exactly what that meant, since we found out that the system itself In addition to having 2 languages, there was no documentation of them. There was no metadata other than what was in the news browse system from GRASS. There was no MAM employed in the system at all. Everything was kept manually, either in Excel spreadsheets or unsupported newsroom computer systems themselves. And the formats varied. We had 50 hertz stuff, we had 59.9 products. Everything was fortunately wrapped in a GXF wrapper because it came off of the GRASS systems. But there were mixed codecs, so we had no idea, because over the course of 8 or 9 years, they'd managed to capture everything known to man, and no consistency to it. So we had to write, or actually Doha had a team assigned that came over and did an inventory of the systems. They wrote XML translators that allowed us to support the legacy, to translate the legacy newsroom computer system data. We have, in the facility, in the graphics rendering, there are 2 42 terabyte render farm server chassis, or storage chassis. We decided we're going to take those out of service, and we literally picked them up and moved them over to the K Street facilities and began dumping all the content off. As soon as we finished the first ones, we brought it back over to the facility and tried to start to ingest it, and that's where we ran into all the issues with everything from wrappers and translations to metadata, the difference between the number of duplicated file names that were in the system, because they just put them in folders. Just imagine what you went through, and it took hundreds of hours of work, and we're at the point now that it's all working, it's all been migrated, but all the indexes still haven't been built yet. And the last one, which is a problem that we're dealing with right now, which we didn't anticipate and didn't really know why this is happening until we started getting into it, but the legacy archive management, of course, if it was full-length content, we wanted to bring it in, transcode it to AVC-intra 100. And they wanted to be able to pull it off the archive in a growing file fashion and send it into the Avid so that they could start browsing or editing in some cases before the files were transferred off or through streaming off the archive and into the system. This has turned out to be an interesting exercise that I don't think any of the major vendors who were involved in expected. We've had MOG write new patches and new transcode libraries. We've had Telestream, not Telestream in the US, but Telestream in Europe, working with us night and day. We must get 20 emails an hour at all hours that are dealing with this. And the problem is that in a growing files sort of environment, you have to put, you don't know what the length of the file is until it's finished processing. So how do you begin editing on something where the front end header is non-descriptive? It's just not there. So typically the file is transferred out, then you can put the header information or the footer information into the system. You can't do that with a growing file, so we had to do a lot of writing and so forth for that. We have to ultimately had to get the 4 vendors to synchronize software and deployment and test them on a continuous basis. So the results of this project have been that all the operational systems have been working since NAB, and they've been moved in since then. All the systems are nearly 100% file-based. There's almost no linear recordings at all. The global MAM is controlling all the activities, although it's because Doha is not up and running yet. It's still probably a month and a half away. We won't know how this is going to work until they start issuing commands from the other side of the globe to us as to what, to New York and to Washington as to how this is really going to work. Since the move, the staff from K Street has nearly doubled, and the complexities have quadrupled, and that's probably an understatement. And as I said, Doha is just starting to come on now. So I guess as a final report or a conclusion to all of this, some suggestions for those that might want to go with this at any scale. First, come up to agreements and workflows. Do it early. It's most important. We had people that every time a new staff member would come over, they'd want to change a workflow. Well, it's hard enough to change it, but to get the end user to sign off on the previous workflow and then just to change it again means we have to keep going around in circles like this, and we finally put a firewall in the sand and said that's enough. Involve every vendor that's involved in the project. I don't care how small or how little they're involved. They are a part of it, and get the major stakeholders to sign off and be involved into it. There's needs to be emphasis on standards and practices in a facility of any scale, but in particular of this scale. There are contractual SLAs that have to be followed. There are OLAs, which are object level agreements or operational level agreements, how the system's going to operate versus how well it operates, or what the quality of service is, which is an SLA. And the user acceptance tests need to be outlined and decided by everyone early on, or you'll wind up doing what we're doing right now and trying to get them to sign off on things where the vendors have walked off the premises 90 days ago and there isn't any documentation. And finally, I can't emphasize it enough, training, training, and training in as big a letters as you can get. The training programs were really pretty good. Everybody that worked on the Avid got trained properly. Everyone that went associated with, for example, Telestream was trained. But MOG offers no training, so it fell on us to figure out how to train the people. So not only did we have to learn a product we'd never sold or installed before, but we had to write our own manuals for it. And be sure that the technical and the operational and the managerial staff are involved in the training process. So that's a quick trip through Jazeera, Washington.
Karl,
Right.
could you advise us on what the project plan would be for continuous upgrades as opposed to just maintenance upgrades, but scalability and upgrade to newer, better systems of any of these components that are essential to the car and in the physical plant, as well as the software?
If you have a good training and a good documentation package, you'll probably also keep good records about what versions are out there. If you look at taking a product and upgrading it, take the MOG trans wrappers, for example. If they came out with a new a patch or an upgrade or something like that, particularly a major upgrade, you want to be sure that that's been agreed upon by other parts of the organization and other vendors themselves. It's sort of like you don't want to upgrade an automation system without knowing the impacts on all the products that you're using. Once we hand this off to completely to Jazeera at the AJWT, which is the world product, we hope that they're going to use the same people that were guiding us as to what they wanted to manage all of that going forward. But I can't promise that.
So at this point, would you say it's vendor lock-in with everything that you have, or is it possible to add yet another, take out one vendor and replace it with another? Is that completely impractical?
Oh, I think that's possible, but I guess you'd ask why. Because if you're trying to build a facility that's the same in London, that's the same in Cairo, that's the same in, Turkey or places like that.
Just hypothetically, if the vendor no longer has been acquired and they're saying end of life to a core.
Well, that's a horse of a different color, I think. Then you punt. I don't know really how I would answer that. It depends upon the product and what the impact is to the system. I mean, obviously, Avid's going to have continual improvements in their products. Telestream's going to have continual improvements. There's going to be new codecs. There's going to be new workflows for those things. They may eventually decide to pull part of this out and put it into a cloud. They may build the cloud in New York. It all depends upon, what the circumstances are, and I don't think there is a universal rule, except to be sure that if you're going to make a change to a product or a process that's going on, that the downstream products that will have to touch are aware of it. Most of us have to have maintenance and service contracts in order to have any help from a software perspective. So, that's probably the first start of saying we're thinking about going from version 3.7 to version 3.8 of this particular product. Have you tested this in your lab? Because almost every one of the vendors get these products in some form, and they communicate with each other.
At some point, you're going to have to plan for a shutdown or some kind of. It's not like you're bringing a new plant online. You've got operational facility, and it's at some point you can't just say, hey, like you're doing with the switch from GMT to universal time. The GMT -5.
But that wasn't a throw the switch and
No,
to turn all the power off and change things and turn it back on again. It was an incremental process. I will say an interesting thing that happened with K Street was that when we were making the final migrations and so forth, and there were no more people working there, and they'd all been trained and were working in the new facility, and then there's about 250 journalist stations in there, so that a lot of, 100 new people got added as a result of all of this. The engineers were over getting ready to do a scheduled shutdown and termination, decommissioning, if you will, of the facility, and in a major power failure in Washington, D.C. They didn't have to go through an ordered shutdown. They just said, we're not turning it back on anymore. Well, you remember the power failure in Pennsylvania Avenue just a few weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes.
your comment about the 500 port SDI router implies that it's an SDI based plant. Do you have any SDI over IP in the facility?
No.
And how would it be? How would you think it would look different if you were to start the project today?
Well, let's fast forward a couple of years and say that there are truly available and proven IP switchers, that the camera could be provided. I remember a lot of this planning was done a year and a half ago, that everything had an IP source, and that didn't have an IP source, you could do the proper either encapsulation or translation, because ideally, this is my personal feeling, is that encapsulating SDI and IP is not the way to go for the long run. And Hugo's smiling. I think what we've done in SMPTE with 2022 and all of its generations is a good thing to get our feet wet, but I don't think it's the long-term solution, and I think many people feel that way. So would we do it as an IP system again? Well, I'll tell you, with the exception of the live studio stuff, it is an IP facility. It's just not IP as SDI encapsulated inside of it. It's files moving it around. And I think we're going to see the word file-based workflow kind of fade to gray over time as well, because
Yeah, but just in all fairness, though, when you say it's a file-based workflow, a 500-port SDI router means that there's a lot of video moving around in real time.
yes. But think of how many outputs are on production switchers and how many inputs are on production switchers, and the fact that they want flexibility to take any camera from one location to any other camera. I mean, that's the good argument for the IP system, even if you had to sacrifice it and do it as encapsulated right now and deal with the latencies and things that happen. I think eventually we're going to get away from that.
Just a quick question about related to the complexity of dealing with the multilingual environment you're in. Could you just make a subjective comment or two about how much complexity the multilingual requirement, quote unquote, added to the overall project you were working?
Not as bad as you might think. The content was libraried and written in Arabic for the Arabic systems, but everyone that works on this project from the mothership speaks more than 2 languages. So the translations for an XML code, for example, are not going to be written in Arabic. They're going to be written in English. Just that's the way it's going to get done. So a lot of it was background. Some of it was cultural. The names, you can see some of the names were different. That took some getting to, but that wasn't a language thing. That was just a cultural thing. So I only emphasize that because there is the Arabic Bureau and the English Bureau producing content in the same facility. They share similar resources, but the GUIs and things were all English, all American, or U.S. English, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about a lot of servers in the plant. Did you virtualize any of them, or was that a decision made elsewhere?
If the product natively was virtualized, yes. I think the closest thing from virtualization, and if not truly virtualization, was the MOG. There are 6 F1000s that are identical, and 3 O1000s, which is the flip the other direction. Originally, as I said, they were all dedicated, which I wouldn't call virtualized. But when we looked at the workflow, we said we have to semi-virtualize them, make them a pool, which is not an uncommon thing to do from a resource standpoint. But there aren't servers that have just software sitting on them and you spin them up to do one thing and then spin them down and spin them back up to do something different. And that was a decision that was driven by Doha, again, because 2.5 or 3 years ago when they started putting the whole system together on a global basis, they didn't want to deal with it. It wasn't our decision. Looking at the complexity of this project, I'm glad we didn't have to do it. Would have been another thorn we'd had to deal with.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So thank you for mentioning the archive. For those of us who deal with archives, one thing I don't hear a lot about is how new facilities are dealing with the tape library. The follow-on question I would have is one of the follow-on question I would have is when as part of the planning for where the content would end up in the tape library and all the servers and everything that are attached to that, was there any thought about what the next generation would be and how that migration might happen? Was any accommodation or design thought put into how they would accommodate going to the next data tape format or whatever they might want to go to after the current one that they're using? Because you've already done a migration from the LTO2 to the current system. Was there any design parameters or design thinking about what would need to be in place to do the next one in 3 to 7 years?
Well, I'm
And-
sure
and
you
the
know my
reason- and the reason
my
I ask
perspective
that-
on this.
And the reason I ask that is because one of the things we've learned is that if we don't plan for that at this migration, if we don't plan for the next one at this one, certain bad things happen at the next one.
I would say I think they learned their lesson by never upgrading LTO2 and never doing a software upgrade of any kind to the Diva front porch system. Again, you'd hope that they would learn from lessons, and I think they have. It's just that their focus is incredible. I mean, there's facilities going up all over the world to bring this organization to the level that it is. And I think they're probably doing regular background debriefs at a level we don't even talk to them at to say, maybe we ought to think about this. You know, I went through the task of saying, are you going to use AXF? And there was, O'Brien and I had many conversations about that, and we just couldn't get it through the mindset. There were too many other things fogging the whole project to say, let's just change the archive standard to AXF.
Did they understand why AXF exists? Did they have that level of understanding of their deep archive yet?
The major leaders of the group, and there was one for London, there was one for the US, and there's a couple for Doha, I had conversations with them early on in the planning, but the manager of all of them just put a kibosh to it almost instantly. He said, we have too many other things to do. And it's understandable. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.